Well, hello and welcome to Rethinking Together, Architecture, Urban Planning, and the Environment. I'm Jill Magnuson, co-chair of the City Lab High School Advisory Council and one of the sponsors today. By day, I'm the director of the External Affairs at the Natural Sculpture Center, and I am joined virtually but off screen by my co-chair, Jim Wilson, principal of Goddard Group. The conversation today would not be possible without our dear friends at Downtown Dallas Inc., as well as Gensler, both leaders in rethinking our future. It was conceived by the City Lab High School Advisory Council as a means to inspire you, our thought leaders in the fields represented by the high school, one of DISD's new choice schools entering our 4th year. And if you don't know City Lab High School, just know one thing. These are the students that will be shaping our future. They are the next generation of citizens, design professionals, and civic leaders equipped with a holistic understanding of the urban environment and the skills to imagine and create futures. And now, together, we are all going to be rethinking our future. So before we get started, I just wanted to thank so many of you for the questions that were sent in advance of today's conversation. I think we could create an entire day's conversation with them, but our panel today will narrow them down a bit. So let's get started rethinking. I am now going to turn it over to our own Downtown Dallas President and CEO, Courtney Garrett, to kick it off. Courtney?
Thank you, Jill, and thank you everyone who is on with us today. Downtown Dallas Inc. has been such a proud partner with City Lab since before the school chose its location in downtown, and it's so important to us and so meaningful because when you think about the focus and the curriculum of this school and the amazing talent that's coming through it, what better place than in the heart of our city to be discussing these issues? And when Jill first approached me about today's topic and really the thought behind bringing all of these design leaders, thought leaders together to address the COVID-19 pandemic that's in front of us today, it just made sense to bring these best minds and these great minds together. So on behalf of Downtown Dallas Inc. and our board and our stakeholders, many of whom I know are joining us today, I want to say thank you to City Lab and thank you to our panelists, which brings us to getting right into it. We have very little time. 1 hour is not much to get through a lot of questions and a lot of discussions. So I want to go ahead and jump right in and ask our panelists, Karen and Ross, if you all would just go ahead and introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about what you do, who you are. I think most on this call probably know a little something or other, but really, why did you find this topic so intriguing, and what is your background that kind of brings you to the table today?
Thanks, ladies. Courtney. Do you want to go first, Ross? Or?
No, I said ladies first.
Okay. Thanks so much, Courtney, and it's exciting to be part of a session and a discussion like this. I'm Karen Walls. I'm the principal of Strategic Community Solutions. My consulting firm has worked for many years with cities, counties, regions, nonprofits, and folks all over in Texas and around the country on projects that make cities more sustainable and more successful. I do a lot of work on public engagement and consensus building and dealing with change and sustainability. And I guess that's one of the reasons why this time is so intriguing and why I'm intrigued by this particular conversation. It's amazing to me how quickly we've changed things without even noticing. Suddenly we've changed all kinds of things about the way we live and work, and it's made a dramatic difference. And I'm interested to see what that means in terms of the choices we'll have as we move forward, move out of this phase and into the next one.
Great, thank you.
Ross?
I'm Ross Conway. I'm a principal and design director at Gensler, focused on mixed use, cities and urban design. So I spent a lot of time with talking about density and densifying areas. I don't think that's necessarily going to change. You'll probably hear more of my opinion on that coming through. I'm really passionate about City Lab because of the way they teach and learn, in part, right? They have broad-based learning. They teach more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic. They teach etiquette, collaboration, policy, diplomacy, how to influence, all kinds of things. So it's a really great curriculum. But I think more importantly, for me, I'm more interested in diversity in the urban environment. And one of the big lacking pieces of diversity in the city of Dallas, certainly in the urban core, is young families with young children. So developing schools that people want to go to and want to stay in the urban districts to teach their kids, I'm behind anything that does that. So for that reason, I'm also a board member at the City Lab.
Wonderful. Again, it's great to be with both of you. And as Jill said in the beginning, everyone, we received so many questions, pages of fantastic questions. And so we've tried to put as many as we possibly can into about 5. Again, keep in mind that we have a little less than an hour together today, 54 minutes at this point to be exact. So we'll go ahead and start with question 1 as it's been reframed. During this time, there's certainly a lot of commonality between those of us who sit in these city building roles. I think we see it as both a responsibility and an opportunity to be able to make a real difference in what's happening to us today. Yet we all approach it from a different perspective. Ross and Karen, you both just really articulated that so well. Some of us are coming at it from an urban planning perspective, some of it from a community engagement, maybe it's management of public space. So let's start by hearing from each of you really a little bit more about the lens through which you really see addressing this pandemic. Tell us how you define what this theme of today's discussion means, and what are the immediate impacts that you see, and what are some of the long-term impacts that you see within your different disciplines. Karen, we'll start with you.
Okay, so as I said a minute ago, a lot of my work over the years has been about engaging diverse stakeholders and building a consensus on both a strategic vision, important priorities, and then working together and forging partnerships that can implement whatever that plan or that vision is. And so, you know, as I look at this pandemic today, it's just remarkable that it's a matter, we don't need to kind of build the notion of being together. We are together. We are globally together in facing this pandemic. And so it's not something where we have to try to point out to people what's in common. We know what we're trying to struggle through all together. But what I think is important is how we rethink this or use this opportunity in the way we think about shaping our communities, and to even go further in community engagement and in designing cities that really do bring all the people together, all the diversity and all of the different parts of the community in a way that's maybe more conscious than we were before. I think that it's partly the way we deal with the environment, it's partly the way we design the cities, and it's partly the way we interact, because each city, of course, has many different sorts of communities who are experiencing this pandemic in different ways. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all situation, but I think we can and should really look at this as something where we've got something that's a common ground. And I'd like to be optimistic and think that it will encourage us all to be focusing more on how to support that idea of working for the common good, and hopefully have less of the idea that it's just going to be about fearing strangers.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Obviously, I think everybody would. I do think that this is more of an opportunity for us than anything. I'm actually very encouraged, excited about the future going forward. I do think we're starting to act more like a singular people, looking out for our common fellow man. I think that's going to be a good thing that stays going forward. I don't know that globally that we're that well connected. Certainly in the realm I'm in, there's a lot of divide between the East and West. There's some animosity about and some blame going on about things that happened and how it began. I know that manufacturers are struggling with issues with manufacturing such. Might talk about that later. I think we're going to see a little bit more kind of locality in certain things like manufacturing that will be moved to the new world and have less of a global approach there. But I think as far as the fellow man goes, yeah, it is going to be, I think there's going to be a lot more camaraderie and kind of oneness for a while. They talk about immediate and long-term impacts. I kind of break it down into three. I think your immediate impacts, and we all know there's 1,000 of them, but we're kind of dealing with less traffic, less pollution, that's not bad, right? Less travel, less crime, not bad, but also less commerce and less community. Yeah, there's an underlying current of community, but certainly there's less real community interaction. But I think there's intermediately, the things are going to hang on for years, even after maybe there is a cure or a vaccine I think there's going to be some migration away from the city core. I don't think cities are going to diminish. I just think that's going to slow. I think obviously space allocations are changing for the near future, how close we want to be next to people or with people. I think more and better tech connectivity, certainly for public realm, I think is an intermediate thing that's going to stay for a while. Better life balance. People are encouraged or excited about better work-life balance. I think that's going to hang for a while. And of course, along with that, kind of more appreciation of family and friends. But long-term, I don't know that there's going to be a lot of long-term things. I think most of these things we just talked about are going to wane. I think long-term, there's going to be less office space need. I think that's obvious. More people are going to be working from home. We've opened that box. Everybody's figured out we can do it. And more companies are starting to get into that game. Hopefully, I think there'll be a lot more open space, more green space. Green space will now become the amenity. We always talk about it being, as urban planners, I think developers are going to see that the same way, because I think their buying populace is going to believe that. I think there's going to be another 8 to 10 year economic growth cycle, just like there always is. I think that's a long-term thing, and I think public hygiene and awareness is long-term. So as you can see, I'm bullish on this and what's going to be happening going forward.
Well, and I think you both really set up the next question, because there's a lot of interest in the whole notion of density, defining density as we move forward. So, I think particularly over the last few decades, planning theory has certainly begun to lend itself more toward urban centers, whether that's what we've experienced here in downtown Dallas with the rebirth of our downtown, or what we're seeing in these suburban urban centers across the country. So as we see this change, and Karen, you said bringing people together in a more conscious way, and Rob talked about your kind of short to medium term impacts on perhaps building in a less dense way. How long do you think it will be before developers begin to go back to a suburban model? And does this bring us into an era, potentially another era of sprawl and decline of our urban centers? Is that a concern to you right now? And if so, how and should we begin to plan to mitigate it?
It's a good question. I'll go first this time, Karen. First off, I think the short-term normal is less density. I think that's for sure. And by short-term, that's 1 or 2 years, maybe even longer than that. But as you see, if you're keeping up at all on YouTube or the internet anywhere, you give people opportunity to come together, and they come together in force. Obviously, if we have another outbreak or this becomes something that's continuous, then yeah, we're going to be in for some long-term hurt. But it's the same feeling we had at 9/11. Everybody's heard this analogy. I think some people differentiate this from 9/11, but I don't. I think that was also a great unknown. Didn't know how to cure it, didn't know what the answer was going to be, didn't know if we were going to be living like this for the rest of our lives, and that created a lot of panic and a lot of scare. We all remember that. This is really no different. So, and we eventually got over being afraid of low-flying airplanes. I think if there's a cure or a vaccine, that will change. But in the meantime, next 2 years, 3 years, yeah, we're all engaged in redesign of offices. I think that's going to be happening. How we do with theaters and restaurants, and developing barriers and protocols for travel, and how you move through these places so that there's less crossing of paths. But you're either 6 feet apart or you're not. And keeping everybody 6 feet apart all the time is an impossibility. So, we're going to have to live with the idea of being close enough to be infected with people. And I think if those affections, either through kind of herd immunity or some cures come into play, that we will transit out of that right away. But I do think there'll always be one of the long-term things I said about awareness of hygiene, especially in public places. And I think the protocols for those things in the public, outdoors, and in private spaces, offices, and homes, and things like that will continue. There's just too many advantages to being together, and if there are no real threats, or we lose the memory of the real threats, I think that'll go away.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a perspective, you hear both out there in the marketplace.
Sure.
So I'm curious, from all of your community engagement work and putting your finger on the pulse, where do you think we're headed? Staying dense or sprawling?
Well, it's an interesting thing. And, Ross is right that after 9/11, there was a period of time where everybody was very uncertain about what was going to happen next. Were there going to be more attacks? How was the world going to play out? And after a while, things sort of settled down and we got back to something that was then a new normal. But it wasn't the original normal.
No.
If you think about the kinds of security provisions that we all do every time we travel, and you think about the additional losses of privacy in some ways, and the additional things like, before 9/11, I was officing in Dallas City Hall as director of the Dallas plan. There were no checks of badges. There were no metal detectors. You could walk right into a city council office, no problem. Those things changed, and they have remained changed. So I think that there will still be some things that change now, and that will continue to stay as part of the way that we live and the way that we design our communities. And I think some of those will have to do with the idea of the hygiene, the separation, and so forth. But I don't actually think that we need to assume that this is going to lead to some period of sprawl, because actually, when you look at the numbers, New York City has gotten lots of attention, but it's really not a matter of density. If you look at the numbers today, New York City and that area has about 23.7 cases of COVID per 1,000 people. Okay, about 23. There are 3 regions of the country that are higher than New York City, and they're all small, low-density places. The highest one is Marion, Oklahoma. You know where that is? Marion is north of Columbus. It has about 36,000 people, and its rate is 40 per 1,000 population. So, I think as we first started seeing all these news reports, we started seeing all the pictures in the hospital, the overwhelmed emergency rooms and so forth. There's been a lot of attention, and indeed there are a lot of cases because there are many people in New York City. But I think that we're seeing that there are a lot of other things that are more important in determining where the cases are going to be and what we need to do as a result. If you think about the underlying conditions that people are struggling with, you think about certain kinds of living situations, certain kinds of work environments, those are seeming to have more impact on who gets this disease and what their prognosis is. So, while I think that there might be a knee-jerk reaction, as there was after 9/11, of saying, oh, we better all move further and further away from one another, I'm not sure that that is really a correct response, number one. And I think the other side of what we're experiencing right now is actually the real value of proximity. I mean, think about, I know for myself, I've spent much more time experiencing places that are very close to home than I used to do before. Think about how many times you're walking in your neighborhood, or you're choosing to go to the restaurants that are close by for your takeout food, or maybe now your patio dining. Think about those things, especially if you can walk there or bike there. I think that there's a real argument to be made that the experience we're going through now emphasizes the important value of having people closer together. that's not to mention that having people close together means more resources, more hospital beds, more experts, all of those kinds of things that you can find in big cities and you can't find in a small rural community. So I think that there's a real argument to say that this could, and I hope will, lead us to paying a lot more attention to the diversity and the mix and the accessibility of places close to home. And hopefully that leads us to even a bigger emphasis on walkable urban places than what we were already seeing before.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's such a great point. Somewhat related, I've spent a lot of time doing research on women in city building roles because one of the token women in leadership in this community. I am asked to speak on that topic quite frequently, but there's a
and it's great that you're there to speak on it too.
And regardless of the woman piece, just to give you context, there's a lot of research showing, and it's geared toward women, but I think it's true. If you take a single parent and put them in a mixed use environment, how much more that single parent is able to accomplish, is able to do when you have proximity to the school, the job, the services that you need, the grocery store, you have parks right there. You know, so I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that's an excellent point to make, that actually proximity will become even more important as we're finding ease and needing to find a little bit more control over the way that we move in a more conscious way, as you said, which I think is really poignant. So moving into another theme that we saw in a lot of these questions was, of course, equity and social equity, and how the pandemic really exacerbates, or does it give us an opportunity to begin to cure some of the inequities within our communities. Dallas, we know, has consistently been a tale of two cities, a city of great wealth and a city of great poverty. We've seen a lot of proactive efforts, like the most recent Grow South, to really push investment to the southern sector of our city and really aiming to bring communities together. But do we think that this pandemic, again, how I started, is the pandemic going to exacerbate this issue? Does it change the way, or give us an opportunity to change the way that we interact in all of our communities? And how are we helping people stay safe who may not have access to the type of healthcare and resources and supplies that others do? Let's start. It's a big question, but Karen, let's start with you. I know you've had some thoughts on this issue, and I'd really like to hear again from that community standpoint where you see this heading.
Well, Courtney, you know, there's to me, this whole experience of the pandemic has really shone a light on those disparities in our community. I think for some people, you know, there are people, of course, who have been aware of those and have been working to address them for a long time. But I think for many people in Dallas and in this North Texas region, it wasn't really as apparent how big those disparities are and how much difference it makes to people's ability to stay healthy. And to be able to continue a job or not continue a job. And so I think that's something that is very much more obvious because of the pandemic than it might have been before. And I think the other thing about it that's clear is that we really are aware of how that wealthy city, the two cities, is connected to the poorer city. The people who are stocking the shelves in the grocery stores in North Dallas probably don't live in North Dallas. And the people who are working at the healthcare centers and the firefighters and the EMS technicians, all of those people are probably not part of that wealthy Dallas that sometimes is the focus of our community. So I think this really does give us a better understanding of how connected we all really are, maybe than what we were before. And I think that could lead for us to redouble the efforts to build community and to really emphasize the importance of some of the initiatives that have been going on for a while now in Dallas to strengthen and make the communities all healthier. and to try to reduce some of those disparities. You know, it's easy for a city council, or for that matter, people throughout our region, to say, well, okay, let's just divide things up in the city of Dallas. We'll divide it up according to how many people are in a certain council district, let's say. But really, maybe this can really help us recognize that it's very important to the folks who live in North Dallas that the folks in West Dallas have healthy neighborhoods, that they have ways to get access to healthcare, that they have fresh, healthy food, and they're not living in a food desert. All of those issues are ones people have been working on. Ideally, I'd like to think that we will be able to strengthen that and strengthen the support for that from the people who aren't themselves in need of that, the people who already live in a place that's healthier, or who have the income that means that they've got more flexibility, or who have the kind of jobs where they can work from home, and they don't have to be out working in the public as some of the folks in the southern part of Dallas have to do. So I think that that's really important. I was very heartened at the beginning of this whole pandemic at the kind of response that we saw from Dallas County Judge Clay Jenkins and Mayor Johnson and other leaders around our region, who really were paying attention to the support needed for all the folks in the community, and how people were really coming together to provide that support. You know, this more recent kind of partisan response that's been going on more, you know, of late, hopefully it will not be the thing that is the takeaway in the end from this effort, because I think we really can see and should see that all of us need to help shoulder the burdens of supporting the folks in the southern parts of Dallas, in the areas throughout North Texas where there are pockets that need assistance. All of those people are important to the lifestyle of the people who can afford to live in the other parts of our region. And we really need to be looking at that as a whole thing.
Absolutely. And Ross, I think, you know,
I agree.
Yeah. I've got one for you, I think, here that Karen gave me a lead here. One of the things I'm most proud of as downtown has evolved over the last decade is that we continue to prove up to have some of the most diverse demographics in the city. And I think a tremendous amount of that can be attributed to the fact that we are a hub of transportation, where we are where all transportation lanes meet, job concentration, job access, access to housing. I mean, all of those pieces that you need to build an inclusive community are inherently a part of a downtown. But let's take it outside of a traditional downtown, Ross. Can design help to create these kinds of places? And is that one way that we can begin to plan toward the recovery and the mending of these neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think so. So you're right. That did bring it more into kind of what I do, what we as architects and planners do. You know, there's a big policy issue here, obviously, whether it's affordable housing or where hospitals go that they can afford to be used. But there has been a big push in just the last few months in talking with mixed-use clients and developers. The idea of developing better, more diverse whole city systems. A lot of what I do, you know, starts out with grand ideas about, oh yeah, we're going to have as much diversity as possible, and that's one of the things we push. Diversity in everywhere, diversity of experience, diversity of type of people, economics, races, everything. The more diversity, the better it is, the more exciting it is, more interesting it is. And I think that we are coming out of this, we're going to see, and we're already in discussions with one particular client in Austin about, you know, increasing what we're doing here, providing some affordable housing, doing things so that the whole system of people who live in an area, in this case, it's about 78 acres, could conceivably be born, live, grow old, and die, and never have to leave the community. And you would say, well, you know, what's the value in that? The value in that is that there's an equality or an equity between all those people there. They're all kind of doing the same job to satisfy that working community. You know, even New York City, which has so much diversity, yeah, during the day it does, but at night that diversity drops off greatly. So we're trying to develop and work with developers to understand the value of including all working types, all income types in their developments, that they will generate interest, excitement, camaraderie, and a collegiate atmosphere, if you will, and those things will create desire to be in a place and therefore more revenue. So like a downtown where you have that kind of diversity, I think you also have a lot more awareness that people who are not like you are just like you, and there's not the fear factor of ignorance that you see just dozens of miles outside of the city, are people who haven't experienced people from different walks of life, and therefore, they get kind of pushed into the back corners. We want to try to create some communities where everybody is on an equal playing field. It may not be monetary, but equal respect playing field. It's a heavy lift, right? But this is a good opportunity to try. If there ever was one, this is one to try.
And it's interesting that Ross brings up some great points about the opportunity we have now to try that and to look at that design for a community that works for people at all stages of their lives. And I've done a lot of work with a lot of the different communities in our region, Dallas, as well as many of the other communities. And more and more people really do support that notion that we need to be designing our cities not only for the families with children that we thought of in the post-war era with the suburban kind of pattern. We need to be thinking about the young adults. We need to be thinking about the active seniors. We need to be thinking about the people who need help with mobility and need different ways to get around. And we need to be making it possible for people to enjoy a community throughout all those stages of their lives. So we don't wind up with little monocultures of, this is a place to live, while I'm at the stage of starting my career, and this is a place I'm going to have to move because I'm going to start a family, and now I'm going to have to move again because I don't need all that space and I can't drive as easily. I think we've got some great examples throughout our region of cities that have already been working and creating places like that. The area in Richardson have been involved with around the Arapahoe Dart Station. That's one area that comes to mind for that, and their Main Street area. There's all kinds of good examples that are already underway here. And like you say, Ross, this can be the impetus to get an even broader base of support for that kind of pattern.
I hope so.
Well, and I want to dig in because you've both touched on it here, and Ross, you particularly, and a couple of the other questions. I want to dig in just a little bit more on that. I'm sorry?
So I'm a one-trick pony.
Yeah. I highly doubt that. Dig in a little bit more on the design, and this came through loud and clear in the questions and is something that I've heard probably from day 5 of this and in my role at DDI, and that's how design is going to respond. And you started down that path, talking a little bit about, you think it'll be more of an immediate to midterm office space redesigns, entertainment redesigns. But I want to get you to draw a little bit more on that, and how do you think it will change? And I think your perspective is it won't be long term. So why are you coming from that perspective? What do you see as the return to this definition of new normal? What will that?
Yeah, so I do have, there are some long-term things that are going to stay. I said that. I think it's going to be less office, more people working from home, better awareness of public hygiene. Those are all going to be in place. And I think then we're going to start designing buildings that support a feeling of wellness or security, whether it's UV or antimicrobial surfaces or protocols for testing, people just being more sensitive about understanding that, yeah, I'm sick, but I can work from home and be sick. I think those are all permanent. But I don't think people are going to want to stay from the office. In fact, we've just done a massive poll that says, office, for instance, that only 12% of people are interested in working from home full time. About 73% of people are interested in working from home part-time. So that's going to happen, and that's going to mean that we're going to, that along with shifts, we're going to have much less need for office square footage. We've got a lot of office square footage in place. So I think over the next 2 to 5 years, firms like ours are going to be repositioning companies to take less space when their leases are up, and quite a bit less space, about 50% less potentially. And that's going to cause a glut in the market. I think what we're looking at now is talking with some of our office building owners, people who own lots and lots of offices, is that starting to hack office buildings into something that's not just office. Can it be office and theater and residential and whatever? Why does a building need to be one use? We're doing a lot of mixed use in Austin right now, not as much here in Dallas, some, but it tends to be striated mixed use. But we're looking at the idea of kind of multi-layered floors, even that buildings that are lots of things. And so I think that's a big design thing that's going to change. And I think it's going to help cities like Dallas. You mentioned restaurants and theaters. Yeah, we're already putting in place protocols and design spatial realities that are changing how many people or how people interact in a store or a place like that. But all of them are reversible, and they're planned to be reversible because no one quite knows where it is. And I think that after a couple of years of seasons of no outbreaks, then we'll revert back. So that's why I say those things aren't long term. Obviously, we have pandemic after pandemic. There's going to be systemic change in everything, and all this stuff we're talking about is temporary, will become permanent. I think design-wise, we're already seeing a big push on more open space, parks and open space. I mentioned that before, but again, the mixed-use projects I have right now are looking at how do we provide open space within so many feet of everybody. That they can feel like that's an amenity of theirs to use, to get out, to get away, if and when they need to, whether they use it or not. It's a perceived amenity. So design-wise, that's changing. So in that regard, yeah, densities will be dropping. But I think with the inclusion of open space, we'll begin to use some of our new biking skills more that we've all gained over the last 3 months. And get out and kind of see the city in a safe way. Residential is kind of going through a transformation now. I think because your residences are going to have to be part office. So I'm kind of engaged with a residential, restaurant, office, mixed use, all those. I'm kind of, and education. I have a tie to. So. We can see what's happening in the residential communities, whether it's individual homes or whether it's multifamily, that providing a place for convenient, easy work that includes better technology, better noise control, whatever. Those are really on the forefront of everybody's speech right now as it comes to residential. So as far as product types go, that's kind of where we're headed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that the whole notion of why we're coming together and what that means in terms of the design trends that Ross is describing, how that plays out. If you think about downtown Dallas in the first part of the 20th century, that was the center of this area because people came there for business. They came there to work, and what you saw in downtown were office buildings. And we went through a period where those older, the B and C office buildings no longer appealed to the tenants, and that's the origin of that physical stock that is now so much of the housing, as well as new housing, of course. But that transition, downtown Dallas is still a critical hub, but in a different way than it was back then. And if you take the next iteration of that and think about the success of things like Clyde Warren Park, those things really talk about the idea that we're still wanting to gather. We're still going to want to come together in central places, but for different reasons. not so much because we have to come to work every single day from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5, and then drive home in our car as fast as we possibly can. But rather, we want to gather for other things, for other kinds of events, for closeness to people, for other activities. And so those trends were already evident in the region. And, at the biggest scale, it's downtown, but I see that happening at different scales all over the region. One of my clients, the city of Louisville, is involved with the Urban Land Institute and Trust for Public Land on their 10-minute walk to a park initiative. And they've reshaped their park plan and their long-term vision plan to, among other things, make it so that everybody in all neighborhoods can walk to a park that quickly. And it's made a big difference in the gathering places, and it's made a big difference in the focus for especially some of the areas of apartment complexes, some of the lower income neighborhoods. There's an area called the Triangle, for instance, where that focus is having a tremendous health benefit as well, and I think it will. So to me, it's a matter of, we're still going to want those different scales of gathering places, but maybe they're less about commerce and more about activities and engagement with people.
Well, I'm recruiting both of you, and I'm going to go off script. Any attendees who are interested in this particular topic, because I just did a major presentation to our own board of directors on Friday talking about some of these issues, and a big desire to create some thought leadership and think tanks around them, because a couple specifics that are keeping me up at night. One, on the stressful side, I mean, Karen, your point about the evolution of downtown, we're just about to complete the last of our vacant building renovations.
Mm-hmm.
Vacant buildings 20 years ago, we're down to the last one, and now what keeps me up are the 34 million square feet of office space.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We'll have to contend through this issue with. So I really am counting on a lot of experts to help us think about that repurposing of space, Ross, and how we, on a more fun and positive note, what we have heard is a greater political and market will toward things like parklets, with an initiative, temporary parklets, our team just worked on with the city so that restaurants can come in very low barrier, very low cost, and very quickly be able to push tables and chairs out into the sidewalks spaces, and utilize, or retailers can move their clothing racks out without all of the permitting that you have to go through. So it's all about this redefining and redesigning.
Exciting. Yeah,
I've been doing that in New York forever.
Right, I know. We're slow and steady wins the race. That's what I always say. Okay, well, final question. I told you this time was going to go very quickly. I'm going to go to our last question so that we can then open it up for some audience Q&A after this. Audience, you should be able to type in your questions into a question bar. So if you'll do that, after our panelists wrap up these last few answers, then we'll get to, and we want to hear from you. We'll get to what you want to talk about. So to close this out, there is so much to be considered. And in these 43 minutes, we have hardly scratched the surface. I think even the most brilliant minds still don't know exactly where we're going to land. What are just 2 or 3 key things that you think attendees today should really take away, should really think about, and be able to think of that in terms of what they can do immediately and what will have long-term impact? Just boil it down, those 2 or 3 things. Karen,
Courtney,
you.
Yeah, Courtney, you started off at the beginning of this session talking a little bit about City Lab, and the folks, the students, the participants and supporters of City Lab are really creating the people who are going to shape our future. And I think, for those people, some of what we think about as immediate is probably trying things out so that in the long term they can perfect those and move forward with them. And I think of all of the things that we've talked about and that we see going on around us, one of those that I think is just so critical for folks like the City Lab students to keep in mind is that design can and should be used to correct the inequities that we find are that have been demonstrated by this pandemic. The differences and the disparities in access to things, all of those things. Use design and make improvements to that and reduce those disparities, and make those neighborhoods healthier in all parts of the city and all parts of the region. And I think that's really something where small things can start now while people are really aware and focused on the heroes that live in those neighborhoods, but it needs to continue long term and be much more institutionalized after that. I think a second thing, as we were talking before on the gatherings, is to be building in the activities, building in the institutions that can then respond and be less focused on just a physical structure that then you have to think about repurposing, but rather a place that can evolve to meet needs as those needs change. And I think the last part is just the focus on strengthening all of our communities, both from the standpoint of the built community, but as a planner, I think also about the interpersonal aspects of community, the human parts of community. And we need to strengthen all of those so that we can be more resilient, because whatever happens with this situation, it's not going to be the last unexpected change that we face. And we've got climate change sitting out there waiting for us, regardless of how well we handle this. So there's going to be more. We need to be thinking about the people and the places becoming more adaptable and more resilient. So I guess those are my takeaways, Courtney.
Got it. And Ross?
You know, I was going to start with just some things people could do on their own, you know, consider this temporary, you know, make plans, press on. But I think that what I'd like to hope that people could take away is that, you know, we have seen kind of improvement in two areas that I'm thinking about all the time. That's quality of life, that is work and play balance. Yeah, there's people laid off, and we have an unemployment that's unprecedented since the Great Depression. But I think that we have all kind of had a shift in what it means to live in a city like Dallas. We've kind of decompartmentalized. We have the ability now to decompartmentalize our lives and to pay even put even effort into our family and our friends and our jobs. I hope we can do that, continue doing that. I also think that we've seen, and we've talked about it as a group, improvement in pollution just by how we're acting. And I would hope that people who control companies or engage involved in any way would kind of take this as a springboard to be better, look for ways to do better, to reduce the amount of your carbon footprint. Like when you're trying to lose weight and you finally get a program and you start to see some weight loss, it encourages you to finish. It encourages me. I'm not at that point right now, but you know, I'm hoping that kind of this will be a motivation for us to really move forward. Gensler's part of the Paris Agreement, and along with lots of companies and lots of countries, and I think I'm hoping that's a big catalyst for getting us all together to do that. And I think the last thing what I would reiterate is for everybody to understand this is temporary. Yep, there'll be another one. There'll be another something, but this is temporary, and we'll grow again.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. Thus far, we do not have any questions from the audience. I'll remind audience members again, please, we want to hear more from you. I know we didn't get to all the burning questions that were submitted. So, please help us prioritize a couple. And while we wait for that, I'll lob another big picture question at both of you that is one of those just quintessential questions that you ask a panel. What is keeping you up at night? Karen, start with you.
Oh boy. Well, you know, what's keeping me up at night is concern about whether we indeed can come together around this crisis. I think, as I said, early on it was so hopeful. every day now, when you see some of the things that have been made to be partisan and the misinformation and things that go around that, there's a real risk out there that we could really miss this opportunity to improve our community and our country, and instead make it even worse, make it even more polarized. And you know, when you look at some of the kinds of misinformation, some of the kinds of fears that people have, and some of the kinds of things that are being done for partisan purposes, you know, that's really not in the best interest of any of us long term. And I worry about whether the people who are most Americans who want to take concern for their neighbors, who want to see things through, who are willing to make sacrifices for the good of the whole. I worry that what they're willing to do will not win the day from some of those other folks that are really indeed a very small minority, but very loud.
Yeah.
I think what keeps me up at night is really not a negative. I don't actually worry a lot, but just we have such an opportunity here for our cities, and thinking about the ways in which they can be transformed as a product of what we're going through here. We spend a lot of time kind of dealing with those ideas, and I could do a whole seminar on how I think how cities are going to change, and removal of streets, and like I said, buildings changing, and diversity changing. But that's kind of what keeps me up, is always just thinking about what should we be trying to do? What are the opportunities we have here? How can we exploit those? How can we get them into the municipalities? How can we get them out into the developer community? How can we get it to the people who can actually, who have the money and have the wherewithal and the power to do that? Architects don't have any of that. We can help guide and teach and train, but we don't really have as much power as we think we do.
You know, one of the other opportunities that I might mention, Courtney, that we haven't touched on a whole lot, but comes out of this experience is a different sort of community that's not just the people next door. You know, some of you and some of the folks on the call know that I enjoy doing a lot of traveling, and that I have had the good fortune to travel to a lot of places around the world. Many of those friends that I know from those experiences do not live close to me, and so I don't see them very often. We're not together very often, but with this pandemic and with the technology and that we can all use for our purposes like this seminar, and just as well for the Zoom happy hours, you know, I think we're all experiencing a different kind of community with the people who we connect to, or who we have interests in common, but who are further away, and that we're able to do that more frequently than we usually do in the past. And you know, that could be that that's a whole new layer of community that can help strengthen some of the ties among people in a different way because of the technology and this experience.
I think those are such great points, and we are getting some questions rolling in now. So let me navigate a little bit here. I'll start with this one. Do you see the possibility within the restructuring considerations of policy, health and equity too, in downtown neighborhoods, of smaller and less luxury apartments that are not tax credit driven affordable housing units within the post-pandemic resiliency? In other words, does it make financial sense, given the downturn and sudden increase in need for affordable apartments and homes, to look at apartments in traditional office buildings? Ross, I think we kind of touched on this here.
Yes, it does, especially if you've got it's kind of leftover space, or it's not good for anything else. Your infrastructure is already there. Can it be converted into small apartments that are in urban neighborhoods, in the urban core? I think that's going to happen. I think the problem that might hinder that is that developers, like most of us, are notorious for trying to figure out what's the most they can get out of something. And so, guess while they may be going into infrastructure that's inexpensive because they got it on the cheap, or it's already there, they still are not interested necessarily in public good. They're interested in their own pocketbooks, just like I am at some level. I have to balance both of those things. But I do think that there's something to that. I do wish policy was changed in the city of Dallas. I think their public housing policy is disastrous, and that needs to be improved. As kind of a little side onto that comment, if that policy was better, or more like I won't name other cities, but if we could maybe get some public housing instead of having, let's say, 0 projects of public housing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the person from whom that question came, we all know and love and would agree with your answer. Melanie Ferguson with Matthews Southwest submitted that one. Karen, did you have a comment on it as well?
Well, I think, and Melanie and Matthews Southwest are among those leaders who have really reshaped this community and really get a lot of the credit for being the pioneers and really showing other people that it can be done. And I think, there should be great opportunity for that. There should be a lot of interest. There's certainly plenty of people who would be happy to live in that kind of a situation if it existed and if it were affordable to them. Every study that I see about walkable urban kinds of development shows that there's way more demand than there is supply, because we've got a lot of situations where people are building what they are used to building and not really what the market would be served by. So I think there's lots of opportunities. I think Matthews Southwest is a great example of a pioneer that's shown the way for that here in this city. Another is Mockingbird Station. Before that project was built, before Ken Hughes stuck his neck out and put his money on the table, everybody said in this community said, people will never want to live by DART. Nobody's going to use that transit. It's not going to work. But after you get those pioneers, you can see those results. And I think that's one of the strengths of our North Texas region, that we do have a lot of people who are visionary and who are willing to be those pioneers. And hopefully some of them can take a look at the economics right now. If the values are down from what they were, maybe there's a way to make some of these things pencil out that didn't pencil out before. If there are policies and if there is funding to help people afford some of those units, then that's another piece of that puzzle that would allow them to get into something that really in many ways would probably be an ideal lifestyle for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have time for one more question, and we have one more question. So it's from our friend Buddy Jordan. He says, I'm interested in what changes Karen and Ross might suggest for those mostly at risk, especially in downtown. So when we think about our most vulnerable of populations, what are some of the measures that we can take, maybe Ross from a design perspective, Karen from a community support perspective, to help those who are most vulnerable and most at risk?
Well, I guess it depends on who your most vulnerable, most at risk are. People with pre-existing conditions, or the elderly, or whatever. I mean, for the elderly, I certainly think that having buildings or systems in place where you can have a full and abundant life without traversing halfway across the city to do it would be a real important improvement. If you talk about the hackable building idea, you could potentially have very robust economic infrastructure within a single building. It's difficult to take retail off the ground of any kind, but I think there's a lot of things we could and should do there. Ideally, I'd love to see it where they maybe don't have to live in an urban core like Dallas, where pollution might be higher, but could live in some urbanized areas in the suburbs in and around in a city like Dallas. Again, some more full city systems like I talked about. And we're doing a lot of senior living is the wrong word. We're doing a lot of projects where it's independent, assisted and memory care all the way up, embedded and engaged in mixed use developments. One, because they're really good partners. Two, they create additional layer of diversity. At 3, they provide safe, walkable environments for them. And 4, they fill up a day part that we normally can't fill up. So that's kind of what I'm hoping will be happening, at least as far as it goes to the elderly, or the people like me. I consider myself elderly now.
Well, I have to say it was shocking to be reading all these things about those elderly people that shouldn't go outside and all, and realize that that bracket is much younger than I am. Because that's certainly not the way I think about things. You know, to your question, Courtney, about people in need, you know, I think there's been great work done over many years now about folks like the homeless community in Dallas and people needing various kinds of housing assistance. Those things really just almost need to be ramped up and put on steroids, and with the recognition of the additional level of social services, the additional layer of health services that this pandemic illustrates that are missing. So I think that there's, you know, that's one way of thinking about it. I agree with Ross that thinking about the elderly and thinking about some of those folks that maybe have pre-existing conditions, having neighborhoods and options for them where they can have a healthier lifestyle, where they can afford to have a healthier lifestyle, and where the facilities and the design allows that, where they can actually walk to the store because they don't have to, you know, it's not a neighborhood of cul-de-sacs designed so the only way to get from your house to the store that's behind your back fence is to drive your car there. There are a lot of design things and a lot of community planning things like that that can help some of those people who are vulnerable because of their lifestyles and what they have or haven't had access to. I also really support the idea of thinking about that whole age continuum that Ross was just describing, because I've worked in so many communities where you've got single family detached housing that works great for people so long as they're driving somewhere. And then once they have trouble with driving or they need other additional services, it's tough. They don't have a way to, they can't stay there. And the way that people often think about things, we have either a single family home or we have an apartment, and the image of that is you know, a 1960s garden apartment, not the kind of apartments that are being developed now, and certainly not the kind of independent living that needs an apartment plus services plus support. We need to be building those in, and we need to be looking at redevelopment of whether it's the office buildings we don't need anymore, the strip commercial we don't need anymore because everyone's ordering online. Those places should become locations where we can really have that housing that suits people at all stages of their lives like that. And I think we would do everybody a big service by having taking this opportunity to revitalize in that way.
Yeah. Well, I agree wholeheartedly with both of you, and I would love to pour a cup of coffee and sit here and chat for another 2 hours because it's fascinating, but we are out of time. So Karen, Ross, thank you so very much for your time and your thoughts. I know it's much more than just the last hour. We've been working for quite some time, so thank you for that. Janie Schultz, I believe you're going to join us now to close us out. There she is.
There she is.
She's on mute.
You're on mute, Janie.
She's still on mute.
Oh, we're losing her.
Oh.
Hey. Nope.
No.
Well, I know she did want to make sure that we thank Karen and Ross, which I'm doing. I know, Jill, if you're still with us, would you like to jump in and say any closing comments?
Here I am. All right. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to Gensler. Thank you to Downtown Dallas. This was a fascinating, eye-opening conversation. And I hope this is not only inspiration for all of you watching, but I really hope this is a moment for our students at City Lab to get excited about their future because it's bright and we need them. And I'd like to kind of retitle this conversation, Rethinking better together. So thank you all for being here. Thanks for tuning in, and here is for a better together. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.